I'm Jim Zogby, and welcome to Viewpoint. Tonight we'll discuss this week's Israeli elections with Ori Nir, then a conversation on the stimulus package and how President Barack Obama is doing with Steve Clemons of the New America Foundation. But first, this week, today in fact, marks the 200th anniversary of the birth of Abraham Lincoln, America's 16th president. For many Americans, Lincoln remains the most esteemed president, and by the standard of his success, he's the standard by which his successors are measured. He rose to power at a time of our greatest need, and his leadership saw the United States through the turmoil of the Civil War. His story's been told many times, but now for the first time it's been told from a unique perspective by someone who himself ran for president. The story is called Abraham Lincoln. The American President series, the author is George McGovern. He's a former professor of American history and political science. Senator McGovern served as U.S. Congressman and then 18 years as Senator from South Dakota. He was Democratic nominee for president in 1972, former president of the Mideast Policy Council here in Washington, and served as ambassadors to the UN Agency on Food and Agriculture under President Clinton, holds the Distinguished Flying Cross for his service during World War II, and is the possessor of the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his humanitarian work that continues. You still work on world hunger issues.
I do indeed. I've teamed up now in a bipartisan framework with Bob Dole, two former presidential nominees, he a Republican, I a Democrat. But when it comes to feeding hungry kids, we get along just fine. We're trying to establish an international school lunch under the jurisdiction of the UN that would reach every hungry school-age kid in the world. I want to live long enough to see that accomplished.
The Lincoln book. Through the program, we're going to be showing some clips of Lincoln, some photos of Lincoln, and also from your career and your presidential career, and campaign photos as well. There have been thousands of books written about Lincoln, between 5,000 directly about him and 16,000 covering him, his era, and topics about him. Why did you set out to write this, and what about it is different than the other books written?
Arthur Schlesinger, who was the editor-in-chief of this presidential series, is going to take up every president beginning with Washington and come right down through George Bush Jr. And he asked me if I would write the story of one of these presidents. I said, well, I've got a lot to do already, Arthur, but if I could get Lincoln, who's my hero, I would do it. He said, too bad. Bill Clinton has already spoken for him, and he says, you may find this hard to believe, but a guy who has actually been elected president outranks one who just ran for president. Anyway, Arthur died shortly after that, and it turns out that President Clinton couldn't do the book. He just had too much on his plate already. So that's how I happened to draw Lincoln.
What did you learn about Lincoln in writing it? What didn't you know as a historian that you found out as you did the research for it?
Several things. Number one, he had a huge ego. You know, we think about humble Abe Lincoln. He was humble in his dress. He didn't have to live in a fancy house, things of that kind. But he had an enormously high opinion of his own abilities. He was convinced that every problem could be resolved eventually by reason and common sense. It didn't work out that way with the Civil War, but he did have a large ego when they would bring him editorials and news clips that were unflattering. He says, I don't have time for those. I know more than those people. Even when members of the cabinet sometimes disagreed with his version, he would say, well, I'm glad to get their opinions, but I know more than any one of them does.
When you were writing the book, One of the things I've known as somebody who is a historian of religion is the degree to which, as you write history, you're influenced by the present. You kind of are looking at the past through the lens of your current experiences. Mm-hmm. There was an interview with you in U.S. News and World Report, and the headline was, Barack Obama, a second Lincoln. And as I was reading your book, I saw parallels between Lincoln and Obama. Were you concerned, and are you concerned now, that you may have superimposed the Obama on Lincoln? Or another alternative is that Obama, who is himself a historian, reads widely and has read about Lincoln, has tried to mirror that presidency? Or are there just parallels between the two men in their style and in their self-confidence and great ambition and their belief in reason?
I think so. They both were people of high ambition. If you're going to run for president of the most powerful country in the world, you got to be close to a egomaniac. I can say that as somebody who sought the office. But just to think that you're the best qualified person for that job means that you've got a well-developed ego, great self-confidence. Secondly, they both work hard. Lincoln got tired of working hard on the farm, the drudgery of farm life. He got tired of people seeing him as the rail splitter. It was his mind where he wanted the work to go on. And so I think I see that in common with Barack Obama.
I also saw George Bush in the story that you tell, in the sense of the suspension of habeas corpus during the war and the consolidation of power around the president. Maybe I should say George Bush, Dick Cheney. I saw that sense of overreach of the presidency, which Lincoln certainly did. I mean, he could be ruthless with his opponents, and saw himself as a wartime president in whom all powers should reside and who could do what he wanted because we were in a war, and therefore everything was legitimate to the president. Is there a Bush parallel? Could Bush himself have said, I've read Lincoln and I'm doing what Lincoln did? Is it justified?
I suppose. It seems to me, though, that Lincoln is the last person on earth that would think war justifies torture. That really left me appalled. But there is some parallel in that Lincoln honestly believed that in a difficult war, as commander-in-chief, he could do almost anything that would forward the war cause. And so he lifted the writ of habeas corpus. He closed down several newspapers that were critical of the administration. I think those were mistakes.
I got an email from a Native American leader who knew you were going to be on and doing the show, and said that, yes, while Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, he also oversaw one of the great massacres of Native Americans, and while he freed some who were held as prisoner, he also oversaw one of the mass executions of Native Americans. Actually, I think he said that it was the largest mass execution. 38 of them, rebels, Sioux rebels, were executed, I think maybe in South Dakota.
I think it was in Minnesota. But
yeah,
he went through that list and knocked off most of the people on the list. There were several hundred people that had been accused, and he cut it down to 30-some people that he did permit to be executed for that insurrection. And that's not one of his more pleasing and flattering.
He was, in a sense, a man of his times. I mean,
exactly.
The sensitivity and the thoughtfulness and the sense of heightened awareness we have today, isn't there? It also reflected itself in the war, the moving from a limited war to total war and giving generals free hand. Some pretty horrible things occurred in the South.
Well, he saw that the North was not going to prevail with the kind of a gentlemanly war that they started out to wage. McClellan was particularly encouraging that view that you shouldn't damage property, you shouldn't interfere with civilian life. But within 2 years, Lincoln came to the conclusion that if the North was to win that war and preserve the Union, they were going to have to go into all-out war. And so he picked Grant and he picked Sherman. And to this day, most military historians think those were the two greatest generals on the northern side, Lee being the outstanding figure on the southern side. But yes, he did things that by today's standards would be questionable.
I taught in North Carolina for a semester. I was a visiting professor. And when I was down there, it was the first time I'd spent time in the South with people from the South, and made a disparaging comment about General Lee at one point to somebody who had said that they were a great, great, great something of Lee. And they got really upset. And I did not realize the legacy, the sense of continued resentment over that, what amounted to rather savage laying waste of the South. And so on the one hand, you had a civil war that ended slavery and preserved the Union, but on the other hand, produced some wounds that really didn't go away for a long, long time.
That's true. When Ken Burns did his great film on the Civil War, the historian who served frequently during that film as a commentator, he called on the great, great, great nieces of General Nathan Forrest, who was a blood and guts general for the South and who was regarded as a brilliant general. And he went down to South Carolina to see these two ancient relatives. They were elderly women. And in order to open the door, he said, you know, I think there were two geniuses in the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln in the North and your great, great, great grandfather in the South, Nathan Forrest. And one of the old ladies said, well, Professor, we don't think much of Mr. Lincoln around here.
There were great accomplishments, in addition to preserving the Union, which was his ultimate goal, and the ending of slavery, which ultimately grew on Lincoln as an objective that should be served. But talk about that. The Emancipation Proclamation was not what he started off to do.
Exactly.
He began wanting to end slavery in parts of the country, not the whole country. He began believing that the southern states had a right to slavery, it just shouldn't be extended, and maybe would end itself by simply withering away as an institution. He grew into it. Talk about how he grew into that notion and became the sort of fierce advocate, not only of ending slavery, but of promoting rights for African Americans. Well,
internally, he thought from the time he was a young man that slavery was immoral and that it should be ended. But he also knew that he was dealing with a democracy where you have to bring public opinion along, and that half the people who lived in the South would not sign on to abolition of the slaves. And so that's why he told the South, you don't have to worry about me disrupting slavery in the South where it's rooted, but we cannot permit slavery to move into the new territories. In other words, as new states were carved out, they would come in as free states. And he thought that compromise might keep the South in the Union. It didn't work. Almost the moment when the news carried that Lincoln had been elected president, a man who would prevent slavery from entering the great public domain, they started to make plans to secede, with South Carolina leading the way. But as that war dragged on, about halfway through, he came to the conclusion he should issue an emancipation of the slaves in the South. Incidentally, that's the one place where the emancipation wouldn't take effect unless you won the war. But at least he went on record, and it gave a kind of a moral addition to the Northern cause that was important.
There were other great accomplishments that you write at one point surprised you as you went through the history that he was fighting a war, yes, but at the same time he was promoting a very different kind of government and a very different role of government. Talk about that a little bit.
He took the vast public domain and said that any American who would live on a 160-acre plot to be provided by the government out of this public domain, if they did that for 5 years, the government would give them title to the land. That was the famous Homestead Act that provided the basis of the family farm unit in American life. The Morrill Act, which provided for a land-grant college in every state, very important. He created the Department of Agriculture on his watch. And finally, as if that weren't enough in the middle of a war, they built the Transcontinental Railway from Omaha all the way to Sacramento. Those are 4 huge historical steps.
One of the things that intrigued me was this is the founder of the Republican Party. Yep. In many ways, yep. The Republican Party, it's called the Party of Lincoln. Mm-hmm. But he launched the Bureau of Internal Revenue.
That's right.
He began massive public works programs.
Right.
And he consolidated power, took it away from the states and into the central government. The modern GOP today would probably not recognize Abraham Lincoln as their leader.
I've never thought the modern GOP party would welcome Lincoln with open arms if they were living in the time that Lincoln was in his heyday. One
of the incredible contradictions that comes through clearly in your story, but in his life generally, is that here was you're right, a man of humble origins, self-taught, only went to school for a year. Yeah. Was a bare-knuckles politician, could demolish opponents and connive and manipulate with the best of them, but at the same time, one of the loftiest idealists of maybe our history as a president, whose words actually live forever. I want to look at some of those words. One of the interesting things that I gathered from your writing is that he wrote all of his own speeches.
Yeah, he did. He sometimes
didn't have any kid speechwriters working for him, making drafts.
Woodrow Wilson was the same way. Yeah. Wilson would have been offended if anybody had suggested he needed a speechwriter. But Lincoln was the best writer ever to occupy.
This is one. I want to just take a couple excerpts and have you comment on them from his second inaugural address. This is one of the quotes that sticks out for me, this and the final paragraph. But I want to play this one first because there's an interesting reflection on theology here. Let's listen to Abe Lincoln.
Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. But let us judge not, that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully.
Yeah. There were some who were angry with him for saying that. They wanted to believe that their cause was God's cause, and Lincoln would never identify that way. He never thought himself as God's agent.
No.
He did what he did because thought it was right, and God would decide what was right. Interesting, he was a theologian as well as a philosopher and a politician.
Well, he was a great student of the Bible, both the Old Testament prophets, Isaiah and company, and also the New Testament. And he knew large parts of the King James Version of the Bible. I think he must have read it every day, or at least very often, because things would come to him while he was making a speech or while he was writing a speech, and you'd see these perfectly appropriate phrases from the Bible being used. A house against itself cannot stand. A house divided against itself cannot stand, and neither can a nation.
In his second inaugural address, the war is near its end. It is still bloody, and there are many bloody battles yet to come before it will be over. But he sets the stage for Reconstruction in a rather touching paragraph that I think every school kid remembers, and the opening line of this closing paragraph is one that we actually has entered our lexicon as one of the important phrases issued by a president. Let's hear this closing paragraph of his second inaugural address.
with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations.
And now I know we're running out of time, but I cannot let this 200th anniversary of Lincoln go without letting all of our listeners hear the Gettysburg Address. Our producer, Deborah Ackle, has put it together, the words and some visuals to go with it. It was clearly Abraham Lincoln's most important words, I think, and they are words that will live for all eternity in this country and around the world, for having inspired people, but also having defined in a new way the sense of what it meant to be an American. I think he gave us that.
He surely did.
Thank you very much, George McGovern, for your book and for being here today. These are Abraham Lincoln's words in the Gettysburg Address.
"Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here, dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. And that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.